Hi everyone, so welcome to May's stitch tutorial video, and this month we're not really going to be learning any new stitches, but what we're going to be focusing on is how to combine those stitches and work them together to create something different. So we're going to be looking at combination stitches this month, and there's some really nice ones in amongst this set, so I hope you like them. So the first one I want to start with is Tulip Stitch, and Tulip Stitch basically combines a detached chain and a detached fly stitch. I'm going to work my row of tulip stitches in between these top two lines here, and to start I'm going to come up on the top line and form a detached chain stitch. I've brought my needle up, I'm going to take it back down through the same hole, and then I'm going to bring my needle up directly down from where that stitch started, a little way, maybe a third of the way between those two horizontal lines there. And then I'm going to finish off my detached chain with quite a long stalk, so that's fairly straightforward starting off. But now I'm going to add a little detail. So I'm going to bring my needle up again just to the left of that detached chain, and then using the eye end of my needle I'm going to pass my needle underneath the stalk of that detached chain like that and just pull it through, and then I'm going to take my needle back down across on the other side of my detached chain. So you can see here what I've got is that detached chain with the long stalk, and that stalk is also forming the holding stitch of my detached fly. So they're both being held by the same anchor stitch there, and it forms a little tulip shape. Now I can join these up if I space them carefully. So I'm going to make another stitch just a little way along, like that. And now if I bring my needle up where that fly stitch part of the stitch ended, I can make it seem as though my tulips are holding hands in a chain like that. Okay, so that's basically tulip stitch. Let me do another one or two. So we make our detached chain, add a long tail, and then we're going to add a little fly stitch component working left to right like that. So once more, start on my top line, and we're going to make our detached chain with a long tail, and then we're going to add in our detached fly stitch working underneath that same anchor stitch. So that's tulip stitch. Now you can vary that even further. So I'm going to start in the same way. Obviously you can make your chain stitch as large or as small as you want, and you can make your tail as large or as small as you want. This time I'm going to do a much shorter tail, and I'm going to make quite a steep V around that with my fly stitch, and then I'm going to add a second little fly stitch just underneath that, just to vary it even more. You could add a third one if you wanted to, and just make them shallower as you work your way out, and you can make them all line up in a horizontal like that, or you could vary the lengths of your fly stitch. So that's a more exciting looking one, and you can play around with that. So that's Tulip Stitch. Okay, so our second combination stitch is called Feathered Chain Stitch. This one is a combination of chain stitch and feather stitch. So we've used chain stitch already with our Tulip Stitch, and if you remember, feather stitch is the one that sort of rocks backwards and forwards and creates sort of interlocking V shapes as we work down our line. And you'll notice I've just turned my hoop 90 degrees so that my lines are running vertically, and I've put some lines quite close together here just so that I can work the stitches nice and evenly. So I'm going to start on my left hand line, and I'm going to create my first chain stitch, and I'm going to work it so that my anchor stitch begins on that second line, and it's going to go down following the diagonal. So I'm working this diagonally down to my third line over here. Okay, so that's my first chain stitch. I'm working it with a long tail, and I'm working it diagonally rather than vertically. So now I'm going to look at where this anchor stitch begins, and I'm going to follow that across to my right hand line, far right line, or line number 4. And now I'm going to make a chain stitch that's going to go in the opposite direction, and I'm going to start my anchor stitch. So I've made my loop for my chain stitch. Now I'm going to start my anchor stitch where that last anchor stitch ends. Okay, so can you see there my needle has come up just at the end of that stalk of that first chain stitch, and I'm going to follow the diagonal along, and this time my thread is going to go down on line number 2. Now I'm going to carry on in the same way. So I'm back over on my first line. I'm looking at where this stitch, this anchor stitch here, began, and that's where I'm going to start my next chain stitch. So make my loop, bring my needle up on line number 2 at the end of that stalk of my second chain, and follow the diagonal down to line 3 like that. And now I'm going to go over to the right hand side to start my next stitch. Make my loop, bring my needle up at the end of that stalk, and follow the diagonal down to line 2. Okay, so up on the left again, so line number 1, back up on line number 2, follow the diagonal and down on line number 3, then up on line number 4, make my loop, up on line number 3 at the end of that last stalk, follow the diagonal and down on line number 2. So making these stitches a little bit bigger than I would normally, so they're looking a little bit clunky, but I'm doing it so that you can see the process nice and clearly. So I hope that is making sense to you. And the trick with this stitch is to keep it all even and to keep your diagonals working evenly as well. All of your stitches going that way, evenly spaced, and all of your stitches going that way, evenly spaced as you work down your lines. There we go. So that's feathered chain, chain stitch and feather stitch combined. So we're rocking backwards and forwards as we work our way down. So you can see these stalks are forming the feather effect as we rock backwards and forwards down the line. I think that one's really cute, so I hope you like that one too. Our third stitch, you can see I've rotated back again. This one's called Tete de Boeuf stitch, which means head of beef, and it's meant to look like a cow's head with horns, and this is a combination of a chain stitch with some straight stitches. It's really simple, so I'm just going to do it over here. We're working between this line and this line. I'm going to start off in the middle of these two lines and start by making a chain stitch, and I want to try and keep this quite round, so it's very important that we don't pull it through too tight. So we're going to just stop there and keep it nice and round, and so that's our little detached chain. And you'll notice that I've kept my anchor stitch really small, so I've literally just come up one side of the thread and take my needle down directly the other side, so that there's no stalk at all. Then I'm going to bring my needle up just above the top of that chain stitch, so there's just literally a couple of threads of the fabric there, and I'm going to make a straight stitch off to the left, slightly diagonal, and then I'm going to come up again very close to where that last stitch started, tiny space in between them, and then add a little diagonal straight stitch off to the right. And that's Tete de Boeuf stitch, so it's really simple. Let me do it again. So we're going to make a chain stitch first of all. So we're going to make our loop, bring our needle up, not pull too tight, keep our chain nice and round, and then we're going to add two tiny straight stitches, one off to the left and one off to the right. And that's Tete de Boeuf stitch. Okay, now a slight variation on this is Wheatear Stitch, and again it's a combination of fly stitch and chain stitch, so it's similar to this one, but we work it in a slightly different order. So I'm going to work down here, and I'm just going to try and keep them even. So this time we're going to start off with our fly stitch. So on that top line, I'm going to make my horizontal open loop, and then I'm going to bring my needle up halfway between those two horizontal lines like that. Okay, and pull through. So there I've got my detached fly stitch. Now instead of making a stalk like I would normally with fly stitch, I'm going to make a chain stitch. So I'm going to take my needle back through where it's just come out, go down to the bottom line of those two horizontals and catch it in place like that. And that is a Wheatear stitch. Now you can make a sort of line of these. They don't link up, but they do sort of slot together. So now I'm going to start my next Wheatear stitch at the top of the chain, and I'm going to start off by making my fly stitch again. So I'm working down vertically so that the stitches are even, and I'm going to come up at the bottom of that chain stitch and make my next chain. So they're not actually joined up, but they slot together really nicely and look like a connected stitch, even though they're not connected at all. So let's add another one. So we start with our detached fly, and we're starting at the top of that chain part of the stitch and bringing our needle up at the bottom of the chain part of the stitch, and then we make our chain. And I'm trying to keep the size of the fly stitch and the size of the chain even all the way down. So one more. Start with our fly part of the stitch, bring it up at the bottom of the chain, and then add the chain part of the stitch. So that's with Wheatear Stitch. You could also add a final flourish and add French knots to the tips of those points. So the French knots there are added afterwards, they're not part of the stitch, but that's just another way that you can add a little bit of variety. I'm just going to do a quick refresher while we're talking French knots, because another one of my favourite combination stitches is Pistil Stitch. Now, we looked at this last month. Pistil Stitch is a combination of a straight stitch and a French knot. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the bottom of the line, then I'm going to form a French knot, but instead of going through where I came up, I'm going to go to my top line and keep that thread taut and under tension while I pull through. So let's do that again. I'm going to come up on the bottom line, wrap the thread around my needle twice and move my needle away from where it's coming out of the fabric. Keep my working thread taut, take my needle through and pull the thread through. So one more time. So bring the thread up, wrap twice, take your needle down far away from where it came out of the fabric in the first place and pull through. Okay, so the last stitch we're going to look at is a blanket stitch, but with an additional knot called a picot, and it's sort of a combination of a bullion knot and blanket stitch. So I'm going to start my blanket stitch in the usual way. I'm going to work them so that the verticals are going up, the horizontals are at the bottom, and so I'm going to just work a normal blanket stitch like that. And what I'm going to do now is add a picot. Taking the thread over the top of the needle, I'm going to wrap my thread 3 times around the needle, and I'm going to hold those wraps in place as I pull the needle through. And I'm going to pull them so that they're fairly close to where that blanket stitch is finished. Now I want to make my next blanket stitch, so without going through the fabric, I'm going to take my needle from left to right underneath the vertical and pull it through. And when I do that, I get this little knobble at the bottom of my blanket stitch, and then I can carry on and form my next stitch. So I'm going to go back up to the top line, bring my needle through at the corner to make my blanket stitch, and again I'm going to wrap 3 times and hold those wraps in place while I pull my needle through. Then I'm going to go underneath my vertical and pull my thread through, and then I can form my next blanket stitch. So through on the top line, out at the corner, wrap 3 times, hold my wraps in place while I pull my needle through, underneath that vertical stitch and out over the top of the loop, and there's my picot. So I'll just do that one more time. So through in the top, up at the bottom, wrap 3 times, pull your needle through those wraps, through the vertical, over the top of your loop to form your picot. Can I get one more out of this thread? Oh, I don't know. Let's try it and see. So wrap 3 times, I'm pushing my look here, hold the wraps and pull the needle through that vertical, over the top of the loop and pull through to form your picot. And at the end of the line, just take your needle back down on the other side of your thread like that. So that's blanket stitch with picot. It's a little bit wobbly. I'm working at a very funny angle here so that I can film it. So I hope you hope you forgive me my wobbly blanket stitch there. So that's our set of stitches for this month. So just to recap, we looked at Tulip Stitch first, which was a combination of a chain and a fly stitch, and then we looked at how we could vary that and add more fly stitches just to make it look a little bit more fancy. Then the next one we looked at was a feathered chain stitch, and that was a mixture of feather stitch and chain stitch so that our stitches rock backwards and forwards as we work our way down. Then we looked at Tete de Boeuf stitch, which was a combination of a chain stitch and 2 little straight stitches just above it. Then we looked at Wheatear Stitch, which was a combination of a fly stitch and a chain stitch, and we looked at how to work it individually and how to make a line of them so they look like they're connected. And then just for fun, we tried adding some French knots just on the tips there, just to add a little bit of interest. And then we refreshed our knowledge of Pistil Stitch, which was a French knot combined with a straight stitch. And then finally we've looked at blanket stitch with Picot, which is a combination of a bullion knot and blanket stitch to make a sort of raised textured blanket stitch. So they're the stitches we're going to be playing around with this month. Hope you've enjoyed that, and I will see you in our first May video. Happy crafting, and I'll see you soon. Bye.